Thank you all. We will begin with our first work session on audit. We have with us at the table Teresa Weatherman from the Office of Auditor General, and also Clay Hale, our citizen member, community member on the board's audit committee. We had a second community member, Ned Holland, from the beginning, and actually Ned just left. We said goodbye to him at the last audit committee meeting. He's moved with his family back to Kansas City, so unfortunately he can't commute to the audit committee meeting. So we would love it if he could. So the board actually will be going. We've started the process of the search for a new community member, and the board members will hear more about that soon. So this is, and as you see in the introduction on board docs on the agenda, in May the school board decided to go ahead and have a quarterly report from the Office of the Auditor General. So I think this is sort of the first official quarterly report. And I want to thank very much Teresa Weatherman for pulling this together for us. We will hear a quarterly report. Also, there has been interest in getting an update on the asset management student transportation audit. We'll hear that today too. We also are going to discuss FY 2018 audit plan proposed topics. And I think the reason we're talking about that now, and we'll get into that a little bit later, ordinarily at this time, the school board would be considering and voting on the FY 2018 audit plan. But because we have a new Auditor General coming in just a couple weeks, the audit committee has decided to wait until the new Auditor General comes in before we vote on a new audit plan. So at this point, we're in the discussion stage where we're talking about what topics we would like to see in the audit plan. So, all right, Teresa, you want to take it away?
Sure. As Ms. Hines said, we are looking at the first quarterly report to the board. And this first slide just gives you the same information she just spoke about. The board asked for a quarterly report. At the end of this, I would like to have some feedback on a couple items. One, the format, and also the content. In the past, we did quarterly reports to the audit committee. That stopped about a year and a half ago. And it was done in a memo format. But coming to the board, the audit committee thought maybe a PowerPoint would be more helpful. So we're going to walk through this. It's a little more wordy than I would like it to be in terms of presentation-wise, but I pulled all the information together based on the comments from the audit committee. And at the end of the report, I'd like to get some feedback on whether or not we've hit the topics that you're interested in and the level of detail that you think might be relevant coming to the board on a quarterly basis. This slide outlines the reports that the office has issued in the last quarter. There was the audit of carryover funds management, 6 business process turnover audits, and a follow-up of outstanding audit recommendations for all audits that had recommendations that were outstanding. Those 4 audits being fundraising, claims management, loss prevention, contract management, and construction bond management. Those are the audits that had outstanding issues that had due dates within the last quarter. There are other audits out there, but their recommendations haven't come due yet, or those action plans. And the report's going to go through a little more detail with each of these, so you'll have that detail. We're going to start with the carryover funds management. The scope of this audit, the objectives were to provide assurance around the categorization and use of carryover funds, assess the appropriateness and effectiveness of our controls, and assess compliance with our policies and procedures. The scope looked at fiscal 2016 funds carried over to be used in 2017. The ending balance, important to note that the ending balance that you see in the CAFR is audited on an annual basis by the external auditors. And in accordance with the audit plan, we focused on the outstanding encumbered obligations, multi-year project carryover, school carryover, and departmental critical needs carryover. These areas that the audit focused on represented 66% of the assigned fund balance that you saw in the CAFR. Looking at the carryover fund balance, our overall opinion was that FCPS management of unspent funds is fiscally responsible. And the next several slides is going to give you some information of how that opinion was formed. The results of the audit, giving you those details, we compared FCPS to similarly sized jurisdictions: LA Unified, Broward, Orange County, Dade, Houston ISD, Palm Beach, the other large school divisions in the U.S. We also looked at Prince William County, Loudoun County, and Arlington. And what we found is FCPS has a policy framework for carryover funds that's comprehensive and sufficient. We found inconsistencies among the comparisons with the other jurisdictions. There was a high degree of inconsistency of how they used their unspent funds at the end of their fiscal year, and they had minimal policy guidance. We found that FCPS was actually the leader in the guidance and the consistency with which that guidance was applied on an annual basis towards our carryovers. The value of funds carried over in the other jurisdictions was also inconsistent. It varied. And the report actually shows the percentages. The report is linked. I did not pull the percentages up in the PowerPoint, but to give you an idea of how that looked, the percentage of carryover for FCPS was 2% in 2016, 2.38, which was on the low end. Some of these school divisions, Orange County, for example, was 23.89%. Surrounding jurisdictions, Arlington, Prince William, and Loudoun, we're looking at about 1.8 and 1% respectively. So we're not at the high end. In fact, we're very conservative in our carryover funds. And again, I'd like to point out we have been consistent in how we've applied those policies. So the first item noted in the report talked about that benchmarking and how we applied those. We did have two recommendations. The first was that financial services continue to provide reminders to principals and program managers to properly close out their documents. And we're also recommending a follow-up audit to be completed in October of 2007 to reassess this compliance. This is based on the results of the field work that we did. We found there were 3,843 carryover documents. We did a statistically valid random sample of 95 of these documents. 62 of those represented purchase orders. 15 were open, but they were for items that had either not been delivered or were no longer needed. 11 of them were travel documents. 3 of those travel documents remained open because the traveler had not gone in and properly closed out their travel. There were 22 non-travel fund reservations, and then we had no exceptions there. So in looking at the entire sample, we had 18 documents out of our sample that didn't meet the definition of carryover or the requirements that we have for carryover. But that's the responsibility of the principals in the schools and the program managers in each of the departments. Financial Services does a reasonableness review. They do multiple reviews throughout. As the year end comes to an end, we get reminders. Go in, review your open POs, close your open POs. Go in and reconcile your travel documents. If I would have counted, I probably would have had close to 25 emails over the last month and a half to remind me to do these things. It's up to the individual departments and schools to make sure it takes place. Financial Services, with their current staffing, cannot reasonably review 100% of these carryover documents. So we're recommending that they continue their outreach, they continue their reminders, and we want to go in and look again in the fall, take a quick look and see, as a follow-up, have we got better compliance than we had in the last year? Now, one of the questions that comes to mind, or some people may ask, is what was the value of these 18 documents and how do we represent that across the whole? We can't extrapolate that value. These documents may range from pennies to $1,000 or a couple $1,000 depending on where the travel may have been. I can't extrapolate that over the population. I can only tell you these are the types of things that we saw, and that it's going to require a little more work on behalf of the schools and departments to make sure it's carried out correctly. The second item that we had a recommendation on was the critical needs carryover, making sure that critical needs requests actually meet the definition of critical needs. We looked, there's $5.9 million in critical needs carryover requests from 74 different fund centers. We randomly selected 15. It's difficult to determine, based on the descriptions that were provided, whether or not they actually meet the definition of critical needs, being urgent and unanticipated. 5 of these related to staffing, 7 to ongoing projects, 2 were nonspecific, and 6 to staff development. We looked at how funds were spent, and there were a couple where the funds remained unspent. There was actually 2 of all that we looked at that had not been spent at all, and others had been spent but not fully. And that's more of a definition. When you request critical needs, there's a definition that needs to be met, the urgent and unanticipated. And again, this is up to principals and program managers to follow the policies and guidelines that are put out there by financial services. Those reminders are out there, the guidance is out there, and again, the review is done on a reasonableness basis, but they don't have the staffing or the ability to review 100%. So some of the responsibility rests on the program managers. All in all, to kind of recap everything, critical needs carryover in general is a small portion of the overall budget. And compared to other jurisdictions, our guidance and policies that are out there were leading and would make a good example for other jurisdictions to follow, but they are policy decisions. And it's a matter of the program managers, principals following those policies and the guidelines set forth by financial services and the board to determine, how those funds are spent. The second group of audits that was done was business process turnover audits. In general, these are done when there's a turnover of staff at a school responsible for funds. Finance techs at the high school, middle school, administrative assistants at elementary schools that are responsible for those, and also principal turnover. We're looking to see the effectiveness of the office processes. Are we following guidelines, following procedures? Determine if we have proper controls, and making sure that transactions are appropriately documented and not fraudulent. The scope of these audits is very broad. It not only covers the local school funds that are covered in the summer, but it also covers appropriated funds. We're looking at procurement cards, procurement processes, revenues, reconciliations for both appropriated and non-appropriated funds. So it's an overall look of all the business side of what goes on in a school. Of these audits, we did 6, as I said earlier. 4 schools, Clearview, High Valley, Holmes, and Robinson, had no findings. 2 schools, Annandale and Forest Edge, had some findings to the point where those schools have requested and are receiving assistance from financial services. When we go into a school, we reach out to financial services on a regular basis to determine, we're going to do a school, do you know of any problems? That's one of the things that we always do. And they're aware of these problems sometimes before we get in there. If they're doing consistent outreach and they've been out there working with these schools, we may or may not go and do an audit because they're doing that proactive activities. But some of the schools, it's an ongoing process, and we let them work through it, and then we go do the audit and then come back and say there's some other issues that maybe some issues that need to be addressed. The reports on these schools go to financial services, the principals, of course, and the regions. These reports are always posted once finished, and they're available for anybody to review. Before they get to the audit committee or to anyone else, the principals have been made aware of it, and the discussion at the end of each audit with the principal and the finance tech of what we find. Excuse me. The other activity or audit that we did was a follow-up of audit recommendations. This is where we go in at the end of an audit. There are findings, management does action plans. We now go review to see have they put in place those activities or processes that they are going to do to address the control areas. We did follow-ups on fundraising, 2 of the 8 original recommendations and actions had been implemented. The remaining 6 are in process, all of which would be implemented with the approval of the draft regulation 5810. Claims management loss prevention, 5 of the 9 recommendations and actions were implemented. The remaining 6 are in process, anticipated completion this fall. Contract management, 28 of 42 recommendations and actions were implemented. This is the audit where management disagreed with 3 of the original recommendations, but has implemented additional processes to minimize any associated risks. The remaining 11 are in process, 5 of which are contingent upon acquiring necessary resources for staffing, external consultancy, and implementation. They require tracking and monitoring or building databases to look and see where things are going and what are the volumes. Construction bond management, all of the 9 original recommendations and actions were implemented. I'd like to note with all of these audit reports, we did post the reports on board docs for you. The follow-up of outstanding audit recommendations, that report is linked that you can click on any audit. It'll take you down to the details, and then you can click to return home to go to the next audit. So all of that is there as well, the details. The next section of the quarterly report is the status of our current projects. This graph shows the proposed timeline that was in the approved audit plan of where we would be at what point in time. And I show at June where we should be for those projects that are still outstanding. Local school activity funds, procurement cards, and substitutes would be in reporting phase. The next page shows where we actually are. The local school activity fund for year ending, our planned status according to the approved audit plan would be field work, and we are in the field work. We're doing training, sampling, process review. In fact, we hit our first school tomorrow morning. We go out to schools and begin these audits at 7. Procurement card audits, that is listed, proposed as completed. It's actually NA. This isn't a separate audit. This is actually part of both the local school activity fund audit and the business process audits. It was separated out in the former audit plan. And in discussions with the audit committee, it was not specifically a separate audit, and that was part of the updated audit plan. Business process turnover audits were listed as complete, and we have completed all of those we would do for this fiscal year. They'll start again in the fall, assuming they're part of the approved plan for fiscal 18. IT cybersecurity audit, part 1, completed. The draft report was issued to audit committee last month. There's 2 clarification points that are being made, and the draft will go back to audit committee before getting approved for final posting. The IT audit cybersecurity vulnerability assessment, that list is being completed. We are actually in field work. There was an external consultant hired to do that. The vulnerability assessment has been completed, the scan, I guess is how we would call it. They're in the process of analyzing the results, and that should be reported to the audit committee in September and then to the board. Asset management student transportation, listed as completed, is completed. It came to the board earlier in the year and is going to be discussed at tonight's work session. Online campus, also third-party administrators' health claims. Recall that was one that had an RFP. It was put on hold because of some contractual issues. Split into 2 parts. Eligibility, which is currently in process. We're doing the field work now. And claims audit, which we're recommending be included in FY18. The telecommunications was removed from the audit plan in the updated approved plan. Substitute use, the report should go to audit committee this month. And carryover fund and ending balance was completed and part of this quarterly report. The final section of the quarterly report is the hotline update. During this last quarter, there were 8 inquiries that we brought in. Some of these inquiries are very minor. Some require us to do very limited work. Some get passed on to the appropriate department for follow-up. As of the date of this report, all issues except one had been appropriately addressed and closed. The one remaining issue is being addressed cooperatively between the region, instructional services, and the school. It was a student-related issue that has come to us, and we took it to the region, instructional services, and the school, and they're working jointly to address the concerns of the parent. The other issues that came, residency issues, go to the residency office. I had one issue regarding a vehicle use out of town. It was verified by facilities. So we get a little bit of everything through the hotline. Not everything that comes through the hotline is worthy of a full investigation, but everything is looked into, verified, and closed out properly before anything else is done. At this point, I'd like to have any questions that you may have or comments on how you would like to see future reports.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and as Teresa said, the audit committee did ask for the PowerPoint. I think you're right, it's got a lot in it, but it's better than reading all those documents. But with the document, the underlying documents linked, so that's very helpful. Thank you. Okay, I have Mrs. Schultz and Mrs. Stroud.
Well, I feel like everything old is new again. I believe that I recall last year talking about the fact that we don't have context for dollars, that we don't understand here what dollars were looked at vis-a-vis the dollars that are out there and what the amount of risk is. So, for example, there was one point where you were talking about the audit of the local school activity funds. Can you give us an example of, a school's amount of local school activity funds versus, so we're, $3 billion. So what are we looking at when we look at local school activity funds?
I need to pull up the old report while we chat. In general, schools can have anywhere from a couple $1,000s to over close to $500,000 or more, depending on the school level. In total, you're looking at $20 million. But keep in mind that this is a state requirement. It's a code requirement that these are reviewed on an annual basis, but that's the dollar value we're looking at. I can pull the report up to give you more specifics.
Well, but it's one thing to look at what we have to look at by state code. It's another thing to spend an inordinate amount of our time looking at it or not understanding in context. I can imagine that Robinson, for example, being a secondary school, not having any issues, that's going to have one of the larger school activity funds. So that's a pretty big deal. I don't remember one of the ones that did have one. So understanding in context whether they had any issues, is that there is no juxtaposition here between, look, where the magnitude of risk is, in the $500,000 ones, we're all good. And there's, a minuscule amount of money and some that need some tightening up. So it's very difficult as a board member to have a presentation like this without that kind of context. There was another where you said that you had randomly selected 15. Why random and why 15? Is that a representative sample? Is that a statistically relevant number? Is it appropriate to randomly select, or is it more appropriate to target what you look at? And then have a percentage of, of the total. If you could explain a little bit there.
The sampling methodology that was used in that audit was a statistically valid random sample. We used random because everything looks the same. The random sample brought out not only the large dollars, but it also brought out a variety across the board. We looked at stratified sampling. We did stratify it in terms of different types. We did a random sample of outstanding purchase orders. We did a random sample of travel documents. We did a random sample of the different types of carryover, but we stratified in that fashion so that we would look at the different silos of how that was being used. If there was something that would have been an outlier, we would go in and judgmentally select that as well. But in order to get a statistically valid sample, we did the random, thinking that we could extrapolate and give you a better idea. But once we looked at what those actually were, the extrapolation piece was not valid.
So I still maintain that the concern exists that a random sample of purchase orders of 15 doesn't sound to me like, I mean, how many purchase orders in comparison are we talking about? I mean, and are we selecting in areas where there is exposed risk? For example, spending more time in areas where there's a greater degree of risk would seem to me to be relevant to determining whether or not there are circumstances. You know, you said that most of this, the carryover, for example, by principals, you know, is a question of whether they properly closed out. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, the board has been looking at, for example, is the financial training that goes into becoming a principal. And that, you know, having finance techs in a building is interesting, but somebody turns over the keys, you know, of this organization called a school to someone who doesn't necessarily have a financial background. And whether or not they properly close it out, well, that comes down to policies and regulations. It doesn't necessarily speak to the professional development of the individuals to whom we turn over, you know, this. And so whether or not they're being properly closed out is, I think, a greater risk if it's in the $500,000 school activity fund school than if it's in an elementary school. So is there context that you can put this in for us, or is it in some documents that I'm not seeing yet? Or
There's a couple things. You're looking at one school versus another, they're the turnover schools. The schools where the principal or the finance tech changed, it wasn't necessarily reviewed because they had a high dollar value. They were reviewed because they had key personnel who were responsible for finances who left. And that's what the turnover audits were designed to do. We do not do 100%. We do select which schools we're going to look at. Some of the smaller ones are looked at because there are perceived problems, and there may not have been a problem. With Robinson, it was a matter of it was a very large school. Let's go look at it now. And then it was so close to the end of the year that also helped us balance out our summer audit schedule, because we would take some of those results and carry them forward. So when it comes to the turnovers and the schools that we look at throughout the year, we're not looking at a lot of time. We're looking at one person. It might take 2 days to do an audit. But we are looking at an area that was something that both the superintendent and the audit committee at the time thought was important, to look at what is going on in a school and give the new principals a starting point of where they stood. That is something we can look at going forward.
Did the audit committee look at, I mean, to me, okay, having a turnover of one of the individuals in one of those roles sounds interesting. But to me, I almost wonder if people in roles for a very long time doesn't warrant look. I mean, why, just because somebody leaves a role, does that trigger an audit? I mean,
Ms. Weatherman, isn't that what we're required to do when there's a change?
It's not required. It is very common when there's a change in key financial people. They usually call them treasury turnover audits. You see them more frequently in treasurers' and comptrollers' offices.
So it's a common practice.
It is a common practice and is something that was implemented. It is something that is recommended for the plan next year, but it is worthy of a conversation with the board if that's where the time needs to be spent.
The difference is, though, an audit, because it's perfunctory to, you know, the role of audit versus audit to mitigate risk, to identify risk, whether it's risk in lack of adequate professional development, risk in exposure to loss of funds and high risk areas. And so, you know, I guess this is going to have to be a conversation we continue, because I still don't see in this a synthesization of information that is helpful to us in a policy perspective, because there's no dollars here. And we're again left with an audit report that doesn't give me an understanding of the amount of dollars and programs that were audited versus what's out there, and where the target of the audits were to the amount of risk exposure that's potential.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that's the kind of conversation that we have talking about the future audits, what's worth doing. So, bookmark that. Ms. Strauss to be followed by Mr. Wilson.
Okay, thank you very much. I particularly appreciate the research and the comparison and the carryover with other school divisions. Because often we always have these questions, are we best practice? Are we doing what we're supposed to do? So that is really very enlightening. And so, again, just to recap, you feel that our policies and procedures are actually closer to best practice than many of the other divisions that you looked at.
That's correct.
So that's comforting. Very good. Quick question on the closeout. I know for some schools it is difficult to get all the books closed out and to have all the paperwork in. And with the end of school, when it comes and when the books are closed, how big a problem is it to close out? Because I do hear rushing to get it done.
I think we're talking two different things. Closing out open purchase orders and open documents is one step in the overall closeout process.
Okay.
I think what you're hearing from the schools when they're talking about rushing, it's getting their bank reconciliations, doing their bank reconciliations,
Yes,
doing their
I
final
guess
audit
that's right.
reports. It's more of the things they need to do on a monthly basis. They just have to get them all done to close out as of June 30.
Right.
So I think we're looking at two different things. The closeout of the open documents is one piece of that. I don't think there's anything else to that other than reviewing what's there and outstanding. And those reports are relatively simple to pull, and it's something they should be doing on a regular basis. A lot of this they've been leaving to the end of the year, and then it becomes more of a burden. If they were to review their open documents periodically throughout the year, that it would be less.
Part of the training. Right, and they would get it done. Okay, on the critical needs and the definitions, who actually approves the critical needs piece when a school asks to carry over for a particular need? How is that authorized?
I don't remember how that's routed. I think it goes through financial services.
It does. So when a school submits a critical needs carryover request, the principal first approves it, then it goes to their region assistant superintendent for their approval, and then ultimately comes to financial services for approval.
Okay, great. That was my assumption. Principal, RAS, and then financial services.
And then the carryover as a whole is approved part of the final budget review. Yes.
Okay, I also want to thank you for including the follow-up on outstanding recommendations so that we know that actually the whole process has been closed. So thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Wilson, then Ms. Corbett-Sanders, then Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Weatherman, for this presentation. I think you're honored to be the first session for our new superintendent to cover audit. I'd like to go back to, I think, one of the sections that Mrs. Schultz brought up, and that is, I think it was, you said 79 urgent and unanticipated contracts, I think they were. Am I restating it correctly? It was 79, I think, and you had a random selection of 15.
There were
or 74.
74 fund centers.
Okay.
74 different offices submitted a critical needs.
Okay.
But a fund center is not. My office is one fund center.
Okay.
Instructional services has a multitude of fund centers. Okay. So it's each individual school has one or more multiple fund centers. So 74 different funding pieces ask for a critical need. So there were 74 of them. There were 95 total carryover documents. And we looked at 15 of 74 fund centers. So the carryover documents as a whole, we looked at 95. From the fund centers for critical needs, we looked at 15 out of the 74. So we didn't look at 15 documents, we looked at 15 requests for critical needs carryover out of 74 fund centers.
Okay, so What, and the standard was urgent and unanticipated. Is that correct in each case?
That's the definition of critical needs, yes.
Okay, so what was, and maybe you could pull that page up again on the PowerPoint, but what is the overall takeaway from that review?
Essentially, what we recommended is that the definition for critical needs carryover be reviewed and clarified so that when people make the request, that it's actually meeting the definition of critical needs. It's more of an interpretation.
Well, so what, when you were evaluating, when your office was evaluating, are you saying that they were not meeting the current definition?
It was difficult to determine based on what they submitted to have approved.
I think if I can help, the previous way we had defined it included critical and unanticipated. In many cases, what we found is it wasn't that they were unanticipated, they were strategic plan related priorities that weren't funded. So it's more an urgent and unfunded item instead of being unanticipated.
So of the
So we did, in this year, when we look at our notice that we used in terms of providing guidance to schools, we did update that language in our year-end notice. So when we look this year, the definition and what was approved in terms, they line up much, much better. That language in terms of urgent and unanticipated was really language from a long time ago. And as we went through budget reductions in our strategic plan, we had really kind of changed what we were doing in practice to really be, unfunded and critical versus that unanticipated definition.
So of the, and this is where there were 15, right, that were looked at?
15 out of 74.
And of the 15, since you're making a recommendation to clarify, how many of that 15, sort of led you to make a recommendation that clarification was needed in terms of substantiating it?
2 were non-specific in their requests. They just requested the money to be carried over. 6 said we need to have it for staff development. 7 said it was needed for ongoing projects. And 5 said it was related to staffing. And that's 5 of those fund centers could have 1 or more of those particular reasons for asking for the funding to be carried over. And what we're saying is that those did not meet the urgent and unanticipated. They met more the definition that has been put out for this current year of being unfunded and critical. Things that they need, but they don't have the funds to do, and they're asking to carry their money over to do that. So because of the definition was very specific and what was being asked for, it was hard to determine if it really met that definition. We thought clarification was needed, and that's what financial services provided at year end this year.
So what kind of, just to understand magnitude in this particular piece, how many dollars are we talking about here?
Of the 74 fund centers, there was $5.9 million.
Okay, so $5.9 million across all 74.
Correct.
I guess where, my reaction to that when you described it was, why would you, if you determined that they weren't meeting the criteria, why wouldn't you say, okay, 15 is a good start, let's keep going?
Because we already found the pattern. So if we know there's a problem, continuing to audit's only going to give us the exact same thing over and over.
But it sounds like the pattern was they were not demonstrating that they were meeting the criteria. So wouldn't you want to know all of the ones that weren't meeting the criteria that was set up?
Typically, no. Usually when you're doing an audit on a sample basis, there gets to a point where the cost and the time to go through and review 100% far exceeds the value you're going to get out. If I had 5 or I had 10, we know that 15 out of 74 fund centers, their requests, we could not say they definitively met that definition. Meaning that in most cases, we're going to probably find all of us had similar issues with meeting that definition. Continuing to find the same thing over and over and over isn't really going to give us a bigger benefit from that finding.
So am I understanding what you're saying now is that most of the 74 wouldn't have met the criteria?
Based on extrapolating 15 out of 74, you've got, based on that percentage, it's quite possible. But continuing to look isn't going to make the finding any better or any less.
And I agree with that, right? I mean, it's just sort of what are we finding is I guess what I'm driving at. Not, you know,
It was a clarity thing at this point.
right. But if 74 out of 74 were not meeting our criteria, I guess as one board member, I'm not completely satisfied with the solution of, okay, then we're going to change the criteria. The criteria were in place and they weren't being met to the tune of almost $6 million in our budget.
Can I ask just a clarifying question on that?
You know, I ordinarily, the problem is we've only got 40 minutes left and we have 2 more substantive conversations to have in this work session, so I'm going to say no.
Okay, I don't think I have more questions, but I think you understand my point. To John Q. Public out there, when they hear they didn't meet the criteria, that's a red flag.
It didn't say they didn't. It said it was difficult to determine if they met the criteria.
Okay.
That's a significant difference when it comes.
Just to be honest, it sounds a little bit like parsing.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, then Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Weatherman, because I know you have put a lot of effort into really refining the approach that the Auditor General's office is taking, and I have noticed a significant improvement in the way the reports are written that make it easier. I would encourage my colleagues to go ahead and read the reports that are posted, because for example, what we just discussed about the carryover funds really is something where when we find an audit that it's prevalent like this, that we look for opportunities to correct or refine our policies and procedures. And I think that's what you see here, is that it's the beginning of that, and maybe once you go back and check again in the fall, it would be an opportune time to make recommendations if we need to change our policies and procedures. Just wanted to clarify that, 5.9 million, it seems like a huge amount, and it is, but when you spread it over 74 centers, it is something where, once again, it's an opportunity to refine our practices, but any one center probably doesn't have a huge amount of carryover. I would ask that when we look at our refining of our procedures, that we have to look at how we spend money at each of these fund centers as going concerns. We don't have something where things just stop on June 30th and then we start anew. And so part of that policy may be a percentage that says we believe that X percentage of the total budget should be, they have a little more flexibility to get through those summer months as we start up with a new fiscal year. And so I look forward to seeing the recommendations that will come out in the fall. I would also hope that we would see a similar recommendation regarding the number of purchase orders that did not meet the criteria, because in the report there is a significant percentage of those as well. And so I look at this as an opportunity for continuous process improvement, and I appreciate for what you're doing. Thank you.
Ms. McLaughlin?
So I think I'd like to echo maybe some of the concerns that Ms. Schultz and Mr. Wilson shared. In terms of the PowerPoint, in my mind, it read like just another summary of the report, and I don't find that very helpful. This is so narrative dense, and that's the point of me reading the report, that I would greatly recommend to my colleagues that we consider our other PowerPoints that we get from our staff, are that we pull out the bullet points of information that are the most salient things we should be looking for in the report. So I should look at a PowerPoint, know what are the high level concerns, and then I can go read into the report based on what the PowerPoint's telling me. This one is not, I really appreciate it. It's beautifully done, but it is, and thank you, Ms. Weatherman, for saying it's wordy. Just it's the narrative I don't think serves the purpose. That's what the report is for. So I don't recommend this approach at all. The second thing is I think it's very important what Ms. Schultz was talking about. The board is looking at a $3 billion operation. And I'm looking at what we have in front of us, and I have no context on what is the high dollar value return on investment concerns that we need to have. So in my years on the board and even serving on audit at times, I know we have an important responsibility to follow Virginia code, best financial practices. That's why we have external auditors. But I don't want us down in the weeds on some of this stuff that's just pro forma that we need to do. The board's time and attention should be focusing on, again, high dollar value. Where do we look at hopefully identifying streamlining of our finances and tackling the challenges we have from a budgetary standpoint. So I don't think that we necessarily captured that here. You know, the idea that there were 15 fund centers that we looked at $5.9 million. I appreciate, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, you're saying that 5.9 million is, well, even more so than what. So if it's 5.9 million over 74 offices, honestly, this should just be done based on financial best practice. It can go to the audit committee. I actually don't think the board as a whole needs to have this conversation unless what you found out was something that we probably have to go into closed session because it's one of our centers that, you know, is absconding funds. But otherwise, that's okay, check the box, it was done. I was thinking, Ms. Weatherman, you gave a great presentation. I would actually enjoy your written narrative notes that you were providing because I thought I was getting more out of that than what I looked at in the PowerPoint. But I guess I would just say to the audit committee, I really do appreciate that you guys put a lot of time and effort into the work that the board as a whole can't do. But by the time it reaches us, I'm sort of leaving here right now from this work session, and I don't even know what was my takeaway. What was it that you'd want the full board and our superintendent to be looking at and guiding you on? And I sometimes worry that then we aren't focused on the things that are most mission critical.
Mr. Moon?
Okay, just briefly, I guess this is the first presentation by the OAG. Also, I guess, you know, audit committee itself have discussed what to present to the full board, and I appreciate that. It's one of those things where you don't know what the rest of the board, you know, might be thinking, or might appreciate, or might not appreciate. So, you know, hearing some feedback from us is important. At the same time, it's difficult to guess what others, as I said. But I appreciate what you're trying to do. This is basically quarterly report of the activities of OAG. If there were more significant things, the OAG or the audit committee might have thought that the rest of the board should be briefed about, that should be brought up. But that might not have taken place during the last quarter ending June 30th. But let's see what happens in the first quarter in the new year. Okay, with that said, I think earlier today, Ms. Delana Koufax and I had, you know, some discussion to prepare for the upcoming budget work session. At that time, we talked about, you know, year-end budget and surpluses, how carryover balance, etc. If I'm not mistaken, I think, you know, staff will be able to tell us the percentage that is the maximum percentage we allow for the carryover. I think, you know, when we do that, you should be able to get that information. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. Dr. Brabrand.
A couple of takeaways for me. The carryover percentage overall is low. That's a good thing. and we've got a strong policy structure in place. That's a good thing. A few grows, so those are glows. Some grows that maybe I can take back with staff to look at. Do we have an audit strategy that maximizes looking at where our greatest risk exposure is in terms of dollars? That's what I heard School Board Member Schultz saying. I think that's worthy of review and thought. Like you could do, should your rate for secondary schools or high schools where there's more money, more exposure, be a higher audit rate than the elementary school? I think that's worthy of review. We've got to we need to be honest, and I'm going to be honest with you from my experience in Fairfax County. The weakest link for most principals is financial practices and management. It is the area, and professional development is one of the ways that we can really close this. Again, overall, I don't think this is a giant problem for the school system. Our carryover number percentage says it, but I do think with some better professional development, we can execute better in this area. And our audit group may be able to do a few tweaks to really get a chance to maximize an audit that looks at where our exposure risk really would be, even though it may still be overall low compared to other school districts. So I think if we do those two things around professional development and maybe a little tweak around our audit approach, I think we can really take a lot away from this report. I've taken a lot away that I think can help inform the next process that we have, and I look forward to working with the school board auditor that I know is being brought on, and I want to be a part of some of those conversations with the board and with Ms. Weatherman and Ms. Coe. So thank you.
Thank you. You will be.
Good.
Thank you. All right, terrific. So we have two more major topics we have to talk about. One is the transportation audit, and the other is FY18 audit topics. Now, which would you like to hit first?
I'd like to see if we can knock out the audit topics, because I think what we're going to be looking at is some of the same conversations, and I'd like it to be more at a high level. We have before you, and one of the attachments, and I don't.
If I could just say, as you're starting there, let's try to manage expectations here, because we've only got a half hour left for this whole work session. And so we don't want to dive deep into every topic, but maybe give the audit committee and Ms. Weatherman some general lanes and guidelines. And okay, so if that helps.
I'd like to bring the board up to where we are in terms of the last conversation with audit committee. The document itself lists topics that came about through conversations with the board, topics that were part of the last fiscal approved plan as suggestions for future audit plans, and also conversations with leadership. We have discussed this at audit committee, and a couple points that we'd like to make is right now we're just looking for some general feedback. And I can take that tonight. I can also take that if you'd like to send that to me individually, and I can consolidate it all. The goal is to postpone development and approval of the plan until the new AG comes in on July 24th, because I think she's going to sit down and meet with you individually and get some feedback. And she'll also have ideas of directions that she thinks we need to go, and also looking at what type of risk assessment process we want to put in place. We tried to do a risk assessment many years ago and ended up with an ERM, which doesn't necessarily feed well into an audit. The enterprise risk management, the enterprise risk assessment that we did with the external folks. And some of the audits listed may need to be switched around. For example, one of the audits listed is travel, local and non-local. In red from the audit committee, and it's actually right there in the middle of the screen, it was decided that this is premature due to guidance that has been provided with current travel restrictions, additional controls. We need to make sure the current processes are set before we weigh in and begin auditing. So those conversations that we had in audit committee are documented here. The overtime use was one that came about from several individuals. That's premature until the new federal regulation is finalized. That's one scope that we could look at. We could also look at how is overtime being used with the decrease in staffing in some areas. Are some offices using overtime to compensate for that? In which case that overtime may actually fund a position. So there's various ways you can look at these topics. What I'd like to do is to get feedback from the board of some priorities and areas they would like to look at. Some of the topics that are listed under other topics for consideration are very valid audit topics. For example, special education is one that is mentioned multiple times. Well, that's a very general subject. So we need to narrow it down, one. We also need to look at what the budget task force is doing, because I think they're also taking a look at special education. And depending on the scope that we decide on, we may need external expertise to do the audit. You want to look at compliance, you want to look at how we're implementing and using our funds, that's something we can do. However, if you want to look at how it's impacting student achievement and whether or not we're meeting the needs of our students and going there, we're going to need some expertise because we're not special ed specialists. We can look at the operational piece, but when you get to the programmatic piece, that's something that we're going to need assistance with, and it may require a consultant. So just because it's put under other topics for consideration doesn't necessarily put it lower on the scale of audit importance. It just means it's something that the internal staff would need assistance from the outside. So instead of going through each one of these topics, I'd like to take some general comments and ask that you also provide me anything that you would like via email or other method through the audit committee, and I will consolidate all of it to share with the new AG when she starts in 2 weeks.
Thank you. And just to review, this was put together based on your conversations with a lot of people, staff, board members. You did this research starting a couple months ago to get a sense of what people wanted to see. And thank you for putting the notes from the audit committee. I think that's helpful. And let's all remember this is not our last bite at this apple. We will have more chances to talk about it. So, Ms. McLaughlin.
So I guess at a macro level, I recall having a very good conversation with Ms. Weatherman when she was getting our input. But one of the things that I emphasized was the dollar value on any one of these things. Because, again, this board and our school administration has been focused on what's the enterprise risk management. And so looking at that, I think is very important. And then dollar value. So some of these things might be worth almost nothing. And one of them I'll just point out because it just jumped out at me was something about auditing the school board and the leadership team, about setting the tone from the top. And I'm thinking to myself, I can tell you how tiny the school board budget is. So in $3 billion, we really want to spend time where there's hardly any money there. When we look at this list and there's so much that we only have a limited amount to work on, I think that's number one. What is mission critical to the system? So Ms. Weatherman, I don't know if it's possible, but I still think it's very important for the board as a whole and to the audit committee, I would say, if you're going to bring recommendations on what you want to do with the next audit plan, I need to know what these things, their dollar values are. And then I do believe that we did an enterprise risk management, so we should be able to look at all of these things and say high, mid, moderate, low, and that's another way that we can make, in my mind, an informed decision about what the audit plan should look like going forward. And then finally, Ms. Weatherman, if you could just briefly explain, I see the numbers in the column, but if you talk to 12 school board members and I don't know how many leadership team members, most of the numbers are saying, 2 or 1. And is that because you said to us, rank order your top 3? I mean, what are those numbers actually communicating?
The number of one of the things the audit committee asked is that I put the number of individuals that actually mentioned that topic. We took the pattern last year where you just wanted to know it was mentioned, and this year the audit committee asked for me to write down or to indicate how many individuals actually mentioned those topics. So for example, for special education, that was mentioned by 4 school board members and 2 leadership team members. It's not a ranking, it's just how many people thought that was an important topic. Mm-hmm. In terms of dollar values, I agree. The difficulty is most of these topics cross so many different programs. Coming up with the final dollar value is going to be a little time consuming. We need to get some scoping and to determine where that's going to land.
Well, I'll just stop there because I know we don't have a lot of time. There still should be, and this is whether it gets hammered out with the audit committee or not, special education, in terms of looking at what the questions the audit could ask, that if we don't have a knowledge from the system to just briefly say, that's probably somewhere in the 1 to 5 million, that's in the less than $1 million, that's in over 10 million. I mean, that's the range I'm talking about. I'm holding anybody to specifics, but getting an idea of how many multi-million dollars each of these topics might be, I think is not unreasonable. And again, no one's going to be held to that homework, but you've got to have a framework. And if I were on the audit committee, I would still want that to help with the deliberation. So I would appreciate that as the audit committee looking back at that, bringing the numbers next time. And then to my colleagues, I would just say, if you look at those numbers, what it shows is there's not really much consistency. We're all over the place. And so that, in my mind, then I would humbly suggest it goes back to the superintendent leadership team making recommendations on what they view are mission critical, and then have it vetted through the audit committee to come back to the full board on where the focus should be.
Okay, if I could just mention, and so what I hear Ms. McLaughlin saying that we should take back to the audit committee is on the ones that we, like on, not the big long list, right, but the individual ones that you pulled out and took a closer look at. So on the first few pages, we do have level of risk, and we talk about risk to different things. And there is a clause in there that says blank financial risk, low, unknown, moderate, right? So is that the level of information? I think is that enough information to say, is it low, moderate? Now, I know that the big list at the bottom doesn't have that. I
Sure.
gotcha.
Right.
So.
No, I think for the ones that it looks like the OAG was recommending, these were the topics we should focus in on and think about. I still think a rough dollar value is very much needed, because we may kick it out and say, it's interesting, but between, thank you, Ms. Hines, where you look at travel and it said moderate to high, low financial, that's great, but we should know what that one looks like, because we might end up saying public interest was high because it was a little sensationalistic, but we got bigger fish to fry.
Okay, so when we say low, kind of what are we talking about? To the extent we can, even if it's a range. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, Mrs. Schultz, followed by Mr. McElwain.
So a little bit building on that, looking at the silo or spheres in which we spend money is of the greatest significant concern to me. And it would be preposterous, I would say, to go to the school board office where, we spend no money. We don't have, we don't even have cards for whatever that got some neighboring jurisdiction in trouble. I mean, we have nothing and we do nothing with it. So that's, we just need to stop conversations like that in their tracks, because that isn't the business of, governing a $3 billion organization. However, substitutes, for example, and the cost of, and the manner in which, and the professional development and the board policies and the implementation of regulations and school buildings on the use of substitutes and the access of substitutes and the cost of substitutes building by building. That's a huge amount of money that has a huge operational impact, that if you can't get the substitutes, what's happening, because that impacts student achievement. Now we're talking about what's happening in the classroom, what's happening operationally, from region to region, school to school, how we're impacting, the quality of, a caring culture in our organization for employees, and how we're delivering our academic curriculum to our students. And the overuse, abuse, misuse, or, none of the above of that, that's, labor. 90%, of what we're spending is in labor. And where we're experiencing difficulties as an organization, I don't see that up here. Special education, I'd be happy to, with Teresa Johnson as ACSD, background, share, work with, help slim down one of the things that we talked about, the charge being, because if we could bring back up the special ed page, because IEP inefficiencies, one of the things we discussed, the charge being is addressing in the charge for ACSD is actually the IEP process. And fundamentally, part of the background of that is the cost of having, if you have 10 staff members sitting around a table, oh, by the way, that triggers, substitutes, that are elsewhere in the building, drives up the cost. Is it efficient? What's federally mandated versus? So now you're getting a little bit into program evaluation. Yes, you may need some help, but that's, an area. $121.7 million we spend on ESOL. Not 5.9 million, not 200,000 in the school board office or what, $122 million on ESOL. These are things where, looking at how we're delivering and using the money we have and where the potential risk is, and, risk is students not learning. That's a risk, certainly. Not effectively using the money to the degree that we could. Now we're talking about the board has a slot of money, and we have to fulfill our obligations as a board with that slot of money. How do we best do that? That's where I see the role of audit potentially helping us, and that we don't, spend money on contracting out ESOL services, or that we don't, do things, or that we create certain programs that would be more cost-effective, transportation, placement, all these things. This is where now you're looking at large chunks of money and large portions of the organization that affect, employees and kids learning. That's the kind of recommendation that I'm hoping that, frankly, the community leaders in the organizations that are supporting us, our task force members on budget task force giving you feedback, relegating it to the budget task force, that they have a completely different role in my perspective. So I would say on my list were substitute, special ed, and ESOL. Not that anything else up here. I mean, IT inventory is a biggie. I think that's a good one. I didn't write it down. But I'm not exactly sure what the process is for narrowing these down going forward. But since you're just asking for initial feedback, that's mine.
Thank you. Dr. Brabrand, did you want to chime in?
I would just say I think this is almost our audit strategy through a different lens. And it's just about identifying the areas in our audit plan that will really maximize our biggest areas of funds and maximizing our plan work around those areas so that we get the biggest bang for our work effort. And I think we can do that. And this has been a helpful, in some ways I'm glad this is my first day doing audit in a way. I think this is a big part. This is about how we spend money and how well it's spent. So I think getting context about what the full scope is of these different categories in terms of total dollar value will help us really identify a stronger plan. And I think we can work with staff and really hone in on this a little bit more in a way that I think the board will find positive. Thanks.
Mr. McElveen?
Just very briefly, Ms. McLaughlin and Ms. Schultz, we touched on those same points at Audit Committee, and where you see the red text is where we had concerns, so that explains it.
Thank you. Ms. Evans?
Yes, I'm actually going to agree with the sense that it would be good to have a context for this and some perspective. I'm looking at things like FATE and ACE, which I'm going to assume we don't have a whole lot of potential there for saving big bucks, because it's not a big enough program. Certainly not like, special ed. But something like special ed, I think, probably also needs to be narrowed down. I mean, we would need some help on that. What are we thinking we're looking at with that? And in addition to that, even maybe sort of ordering this, by here are the big bucks, but not everything with big bucks has potential for savings either. I mean, we could audit I'm going to make an assumption here. Tell me if I'm wrong, Ms. Weatherman. We could audit VRS until the cows come home, and we wouldn't save a dime on it because we just have to pay our bill, right? So that's a big chunk of change, but there's just no point in auditing it. So I think it would be good for you to give us some sense of where you see some potential, or where your professional staff does.
Thank you. All right. Ms. Palchik, followed by Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you, Ms. Weatherman. As I'm looking at this, I know it's been a little while. I know you had facilities and transportation on the list, a little bit vague on there, and we're about to look at the FPAC report, talking about things such as identifying emerging capacity issues, looking at the possibility of increasing the bond funding, and really looking at the cost drivers related especially to deferred maintenance. So I see you shaking your head. So just wondering, to me, it seems like that would be an area that would both fulfill, large expenditures and ways that we could maybe start to dive deeply with recommendations from FPAC and staff as to what audit's role might be there.
And some of those areas aren't on here because they've been looked at fairly recently. There was a fairly intensive study on preventative maintenance. That doesn't mean it's not worthy of a look, but what we're looking at is areas that hadn't been looked at. We looked at the bond audit, actually recommended a review of our bond levels, but they're all valid topics for consideration. Thank you.
Sure. No, and I guess, and I knew we'd covered some, but specifically in there, will you be reviewing, I guess, the FPAC report to see if or is that our role or audit committee's role to kind of recommend?
That is something that the Auditor General can look at as for consideration to add to this. This, in a summary, is just a snapshot of all the topics that came across. We didn't narrow it down purposely because I don't know what direction we're going to be going, and I needed to get the feedback from the board in order to help provide that feedback and information when the Auditor General comes in 2 weeks. So that is an area of resource that we can use to help narrow this down as well.
Thank you.
Ms. Corbett-Sanders, then Ms. Strauss.
I'm going to echo a bit of what Dr. Brabrand was mentioning. I think what would help us in our work, and I apologize because I was not at the last audit committee meeting, but what would help us is framing the prioritization of our work plan along 3 categories. First category being high value, financial value, big bucks. The second one being impact on reputational risk, because sometimes it may be a very low dollar value, but the reputational risks for the system would blow up all of the goodwill we may have in an area. And then the third being operational risk, which is typically tied more closely with the financial risk.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Strauss?
I've noted on the list, IT is mentioned in 3 different ways, and I'm always torn because I think the board and the school division, as we try to move forward to provide the IT services, both on the business side and instructional side, in the best way possible looking forward. And of course, there's a huge push to do it all very quickly, and it's expensive and we can't. But so I'm always torn between, is this an audit area or is it really a consultant study to advise us how best to move forward? What should our vision be for the next 5-10 years? So much has changed, so much changes so quickly. Kids bring equipment in, parents bring equipment in. It's just an ever-moving target. So I don't know, in terms of audit, and I look at IT in inventory management, the pieces that are listed here are very auditable. Is it worth auditing? I don't know. Because, as I say, I would like a better opinion as to how to manage ourselves going forward. Our budgets are so tight. There's so much that we would like to do and can't do. Huge push to get to 1-to-1. How do we get there? How do we use it? So I don't know. but I would like to keep it on the table, either as a consultant study to help us have a plan for going forward. And if there's anything that audit can do that helps give us more information, that would be great. But I'm conflicted because I kind of see two ways to go with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Hale, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit if you don't mind. Because we really do benefit greatly. I think the audit committee members really value your the experience you bring from other sectors, so you've heard us kind of wrestling with this idea of, as we put together an audit plan, what should our priorities be and what should we be looking at? Do you have any general advice for us when we're doing that?
Ms. Corbett Sanders, a lot of the really good advice. You need to look at it. You need to try and quantify it. That's a lot of people are asking quantification, so you need that somehow. And you need probability also. So you're looking at the impact and looking at the risk are the two things. And I heartily agree. Impact is broad. It includes more than just the financial impact. So I think putting together a matrix that considers those things would be helpful to the board.
Thank you very much. All right. Okay, so thank you. We're on to transportation, I think, right? Do we need Mr. Plattenberg to come join us?
Yes, please. Okay. While he joins us at the table and we pull up the PowerPoint for facilities, I want to briefly give you a 5-cent overview of the transportation audit, what we did. This was part 2 of the asset management audit focused on student transportation because both materiality of the assets and the risk of transporting students. The audit was performance with a focus on legislative compliance. Student transportation is very highly regulated at the state and federal, local levels, and compliance was an important factor. We looked at the relationship between the county for maintenance, repair, driver hiring, qualifications, safety requirements, and issues that impact the safe operation of our vehicles. We reviewed driver records, maintenance records. We conducted site visits at the garage, held focus groups, did a ride-along, analyzed invoices, accident reports. It was incident reports as well. We had 4 areas of findings that I think facilities is going to go through what their activities have been related to those. Here's the PowerPoint clicker. I think at this point in summary, in the executive summary of the report, draws your attention to the highest area of data management improvement, looking at discipline records, distracted drivers, gaps in documentation. A lot of what we found was documentation issues. Not necessarily that it wasn't done, but we couldn't say it was done because maybe a box wasn't checked or whatever. Other significant findings had to do with the agreement between the county and the schools. And we had some vehicles that we did not find documented compliance with the preventative maintenance schedule. That doesn't mean they were not compliant. It meant our documentation didn't have the box checked. So our documentation wasn't as thorough. What we can say with absolute certainty, in meeting with the county staff doing the maintenance, the dedication and their attitude towards the maintenance of our buses and the safety of our children is something that we found to be admirable. They don't want those buses going out the door unless they're comfortable. In fact, several actually made the statement that my children are going to be on these buses. They're not going till I'm happy that my kid would be there and I'd be safe. So their dedication and attention to detail and helping us manage our fleet and the safety of our buses and transportation, I think, is something that needs to be considered and also applauded. It's a collaborative effort between our facilities and transportation folks and the county folks that makes us as successful as we are at the safety aspects and also the transportation of our students. You figure our bus fleet is larger than, I think, the Greyhound fleet at this point. And we travel many more miles and with minimal incidents. So with that, that's kind of a general overview. You've had the opportunity, I'm sure, to see the report, but I think what we have is an overview from facilities, and I'll turn it over to Jim.
Hang on a sec. Ms. Evans, did you want to talk first? Oh, okay. All right. Mr. Plattenberg, thank you for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for allowing us to speak this evening. And for the sake of trying to maintain what Dr. Brabrand started, which was keeping us on time, I'm really just going to hit the high points. If you take a look at, rather than go through my whole entire presentation, we responded in the way that I think Ms. McLaughlin mentioned about looking at some of these reports. It wasn't wordy, it was the finding, it was the recommendation, it was staff's response, and then where we are. But in summary, really, in the brief summary that I want to provide, out of the 12 findings that were identified, 3 were about relationships with the County Department of Vehicle Services. As Teresa just mentioned, she touched on that rather well. And I'll go through these in just a minute. 2 were safety related, mostly student discipline. 4 were relating to drivers, and 2 related to vehicles, which really ties back into DVS, but it bifurcated that out. And then 1 incident about incident records maintenance, right? How long do we maintain records? But out of those findings, one of them was the 3 relationship with DVS. One was about a formal agreement, where I'm in the final throes of the development of a formal agreement with our school board council that we, Francine, and the people of DVS are aware of, to basically check that off the box. And the second one is really the charges and identification of those charges. We did have comparison data that was provided by a third-party group that was provided in the management response from the county that was done by Hammer and Dolly in March of the year of the audit, that did a comparison of them that showed that, in fact, their charges were less than, significantly less than, those not only of the region but also those in the surrounding commercial areas. So that had been addressed as well and had been described. What they said was that amount that was included that was required for the audit folks to go back and have further inquiry about is that it was a quality control, $16.50 per vehicle charge. Well, we came to find out through this process that was beneficial that, in fact, you know, if you're paying $16.50, then we truly want to get the quality control rather than our children are going to be on this. And we all own this. It wasn't just the county. It was the county and our staff. Relating to drivers, it really had to do with some of our personal processing and so forth about medical clearances. And it wasn't that they weren't done, it's just that the records weren't as tight as they should be. And in working partnership with HR, we've done an excellent job of identifying in those areas where we now have the agility requirements on the driver ride-alongs that we stipulate. That wasn't a county stipulation. That was something that FCPS did and above and beyond. But it is something that we feel is important. The drug test and so forth and the retest tracking, we tightened that up. And then the fourth one was the ongoing CPR, the initial TB, the character references, and the things that you basically already have processes in place, but we didn't have our own inspect what you expect component. And that's always an opportunity that we look for on the support side to improve. And then again, the 2 that related to vehicles was 1 to 45-day PM, and then the average fleet age. And I can tell you that we now have access to records that are provided daily by the county DVS to our staff so that we can maintain and manage the fleet to certainly identify any outliers that aren't in accordance with their 45-day PM. For example, if the driver went to pick up a spare and therefore their bus wasn't being driven, but it hadn't been taken in, so that we can immediately rectify that and get that over for their 45-day preventive maintenance. And then finally, the incident records maintained for 1 year. We've reviewed that and we've looked at it in accordance with the records management. It really is the current year plus 1 that we need, not necessarily the 5. So that is what we're going to be in conformance. So in summary, the audit performed exactly what you wanted to do. When you have Teresa Weatherman and her team come in and work with you to identify the opportunities of where you may or others may not be managing as well as you would like, as prescribed, as the processes and protocols, in fact, provide the framework for. It provided us a great opportunity to, as I said, inspect what we expect and put those assurances and quality control checks and balances so that our teams are now reviewing those on a periodic basis as a team member, not one individual relying upon their memory, their ability, or their software or their data, but a group, a team approach to collaborate to make sure that we're in fact in compliance. So that's my brief summary rather than going through all of those, but I'm by the way, with the school board's assistance and the coup foray on this whole presentation really is that we've gone from, it was identified, I believe, at 28% over the 15-year average on the fleet. Well, with your graciousness and with finance working with us, again, the team approach, with the purchase of the additional buses coming in, we'll be down to 12% over. And that's a significant inroad that we are greatly appreciative of to make sure that our fleet stays current. So with that, I'm open to any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Evans, followed by Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you. This was a fascinating report, and I guess I'm just going to go to you, Mr. Plattenberg. You mentioned the $16.50 fee, which have we asked them to waive that for us? I mean, that's $480,000 or $470,000 a year. I mean, are we actually getting anything for that $16.50, that $480,000?
We are, but it was not to the extent that you would expect. Okay, so basically that's the quality assurance, the management supervisory role that, again, we found out that there were some loopholes in it. And as was stated, it wasn't all the time. It was just periodic. So when you didn't have the assurances that the inspection, the quality control was taking place, then we had to put those protocols in place to make sure that we can periodically examine those records, which they provide to us, and make sure that, in fact, we are getting the quality control. And they also identified a way that they could manage their the forms that they're checking off as to what was inspected, whether it was the brake lines, brake pads, air pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was so that they could improve their processes as well and their supervision and the corrective action associated with that. So really, it was kind of a 360 review, I think, that all of us then came up with better ideas than what the audit findings were. But it was so sporadic, it wasn't something where you could go back and say, okay, well, this is a $480,000 hit. We want $12,000 back.
This is a significant amount. You know, $24 million a year in maintenance. I'm thinking that's what, about $14,500 per bus per year. So just kind of thinking of it in those terms, does that seem like a reasonable amount of maintenance costs? Ms. Weatherman, perhaps, did you find that is a reasonable amount for us to spend per bus per year?
Comparatively speaking, that's not as high as we would spend if we went outside. And the other thing is those costs. One of the hard things is we can't negotiate those costs. Those rates are based and set fees by the Board of Supervisors. So every year they go in and they set their fees. These costs are not just FCPS. These are the same costs that are charged to fire and rescue, to police, to the fast tram buses. Everyone that utilizes the DVS services pays the same fees, and those fees are approved by the board. But comparatively speaking, it's cheaper to go, and I think that's what you were saying in the external report when Mr. Plattenberg first started, that's been compared in the past, and this is more economical.
Are we their biggest customer?
We are their largest customer, yes.
Okay, probably by far, right? The 1,670
it's a little over
buses?
50-some%. I think they told me it was like 51 or 52%.
Oh, we constitute more than half of their...
52, according to Ms. Furby.
Okay. So, when they set the fee, that makes... Well, I mean, one question I have, would it be cheaper for us to do it ourselves?
Well, currently there are a lot, I can tell you from having done that before, there are a lot of startup costs associated with that. And to be really blunt, given the current economic environment and the evolution and the size of our fleet and the need for bus compounding everywhere across this, I really don't see that as a possibility. And I think when the county a few years back, prior to me coming here, went out and had another vendor come in to basically run their show, they found how challenging that really was.
Did they?
And in short order, yes, they had
tried that before.
The county did, in fact, yes, and it was problematic.
All right. Well, then the only other comment I had was on student behavior, which we probably don't save any money by dealing with student behavior, but we may save ourselves bus drivers.
Absolutely, and this was an opportunity where the drivers that we identified were the ones that identified this area of I'll call it an area of opportunity.
Right.
Because we really weren't cycling back with principals, and we had a lot of principal transition through the years, as you know, and we weren't articulating the importance of it. And, we have plenty of meetings with the representatives and so forth, and plenty of opportunities. to have done our homework ourselves. But when this came up, it was to me, it was one of these things where I said, this is a no-brainer. I can handle this. This is my wheelhouse. We work real well together, and we've included a component here that we haven't had to use, in fact. If we have issues where we're not getting responsiveness, we have a protocol now where we'll kick it up to the regional superintendents. I don't think that's ever going to be necessary. I really don't.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're following up very forcefully on that. So we do need to deal with that. Thank you.
Okay, I have Ms. McLaughlin followed by several other board members. And just a reminder, we are running over and we have 3 other work sessions tonight. So, Ms. McLaughlin?
So I guess the first thing in the report, and I do appreciate it brought a lot of interesting data to the board's attention, and hopefully for this incoming superintendent. Where it talked about the cost, well, it talked about the annual accidents and saying that about 50% of the accidents were deemed preventable, but the report didn't talk about what do these accidents cost us per year, because then that might help us quantify, okay, if annually the dollar value for having to repair buses or repair cars that were deemed as hit by our buses and we're at fault, what has been our cost liability from those accidents? And if 50% of them are preventable, then I think that helps drive the conversation of how big a deal is this? So is there a reason that wasn't covered in the report?
It's actually covered on page 20 of the report. In 2016, the estimated cost of repairs to buses, for backing incidents, was $32,000.
But Ms. Weatherman, that's not the
just,
only...
I corrected myself. It was just the backing incidents that was there. I don't have that I see the data for the total cost for all accidents. I don't see that in the report, and I'd have to go back through the work papers to see it was there.
Okay.
Do you have an estimate, Mr. Plattenberg?
No, I don't, because what we include is anytime a bus scratches anything, if a side mirror hits something, if a tree limb hits something, if a tree limb falls on a bus, each one of those incidences are reported. Some are then deemed as accidents. So it may be that there isn't any appreciable damage, but to answer the question, no, I don't have that data before me.
No, that's okay. I'm recommending, I think that should be part of the report. I mean, if we're trying to understand what happens with the accidents each year, what are the costs associated with it, if you don't have the information, you can't make decisions and you can't make judgment calls on whether it's a problem or not. So given what the transportation costs us, I think it's 5% of our total budget. I mean, we're not talking about a small number. So I'm more of, I guess, wondering why the Auditor General's office didn't ask it. I'm not really looking to you, Mr. Plattenberg. They conduct the audit. You just have to provide the information they ask for. And I would humbly suggest that needs to be
I don't know if it was asked. I'd have to go back to the work papers. It's possible it was asked and it wasn't appreciable. I don't know.
And respectfully, the majority of the costs that we talk about, we talk about the sticker shock number, and it's a big number. 5% is a big number. But when you look at the evaluation of the parts and labor and fuel, you just ate up over 80%, I don't know the exact percent of that total budget. I mean, it's significant. Good question. Need to have the answer. Need to provide that, because if we're going to look at it, we might as well peel all the layers of the onion back and see what's at the core. But overall, when you look at the transportation budget, although it's a big number, the majority of that is fuel and labor and parts.
No, I appreciate that, Mr. Plattenberg, that I'm really coming at this from an audit perspective. If you run an audit and you want to be able to identify where some of your risk factors and operations are, if you don't have the dollar numbers, you don't know whether it's a problem or not. So I think that's one of the big things that I didn't see there, and I think it's important to get those numbers. And anyone reading the report from a public standpoint, because we chose to give that data point that 50% of accidents were preventable, but as echoing Ms. Schultz at the beginning of the night, of what dollar amount is this affecting us? And then the other thing is that I appreciate looking at the age of the fleet. 42% of the buses are 12 years old or more, and it's recommended that you really should be replacing, buses by then, and certainly by, year 15, it's really a problem. So I know, Mr. Plattenberg, you were expressing appreciation to the board for approving some of the purchases in recent years, but I'm wondering in terms from a findings perspective in this report, if this is again something that's got to be part of the board and the superintendent's conversation of, that's a pretty significant portion that's aging, and we'd better have a, sinking fund plan in place, and maybe we do, but I think for all of us at the board each year, when we look at what we have to pay for, this report is something we should be referencing and saying why. And then, there was one other area in the report that jumped out at me, but if I can just follow up with you, Ms. Weatherman.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Moon, followed by Ms. Strauss.
Just a couple of comments and questions. On the aging fleet issue, I'm glad to hear that now the percentage of the buses over 15 years will be going down to 12% from 28. That's a significant decrease. We have how many buses? 1,700, 16?
We have 1,630 in our operational.
Yeah, 630. If you multiply that by 16%, that gives me over 250 or 260 buses. We are actually purchasing or leasing 260 new buses next year.
Yeah, we did order 200 last year, so.
Okay, that's glad to know. But for the remaining 12%, if our policy is requiring replacement for buses older than 15, do you think that 15 is a reasonable number, or is that if the buses are manufactured to be in a better condition as years go along, whether we can have them move up and still be reasonable? Is there like a break point where the cost of a maintenance exceeds lease purchase payment on a yearly basis? So I'm trying to see whether whether I can, as a board member, could go out and advocate to bring in more new buses so that we can eliminate all of the buses older than a certain number of years.
You raised an excellent point, Mr. Moon. In short, I'll say that the recommendation is a 12-year average life cycle.
12 years.
But when you have 15 and a fleet the size of ours, and you look at how many, to your point, about the assets, like 200 and some in a year, and the cost of lease purchase, it's a significant bite of the apple when you go out and buy a large quantity or have to replace a large quantity at any one time.
So are you still saying that for those buses, even older than 12 or even 15, the yearly lease purchase payment is greater than maintenance cost?
Well, where we have issues, and I'll call it the lemon law kind of mindset, where we have vehicles that are, I call them frequent flyers of maintenance and operating expenses, DVS helps identify those for our replacement vehicles. We also know because they're the ones that break down the most. And we try to get those out as soon as we possibly can.
Okay, we'll have a further conversation on this outside. One more, just one has to do with the behavior of students on the buses, that I was disappointed to learn that there had not been much of follow-up from school administrators or.
Yes, sir. There was follow-up from the school administrators. I'm sorry that came across that way. The problem is we didn't cycle back either the driver getting the driver's supervisor or the school giving it to the driver's supervisor what actually occurred. Because the majority of the time, the principal had dealt with the student issue, the discipline issue.
I'm probably less interested in knowing exactly what happened to the particular student or group of students. But
yes, sir.
as long as the same behaviors are repeated by same students or other students in the bus, maybe we have accomplished our purposes, goals by reporting to the school administrators. But do we have those data, whether it's a recidivism rate or repeat offenses?
Sure. What we are doing is we are recording the frequencies of the same students. A lot of the documentation, I mean, the students are being disciplined by the school. A lot of the documentation may not have been circled back, as Mr. Plattenberg stated. So the information that we're collecting in a database now is from the student incident reports. The area offices are recording that in a spreadsheet, in an Excel spreadsheet, and we're looking to have a more formal database that we'll be able to run reports from. But we do feel confident that, you know, when the students, when we do report the students to the schools, there is discipline handled through the school. It's just not always documented like we need it to be, and we're correcting that.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Strauss, followed by Ms. Corbett Sanders, and then Mrs. Schultz.
Very brief. Thank you for the comparative labor cost for the repairs. That looks as though we, in fact, are at the lower end. So I think that again shows that at least the repairs and the maintenance coming through DVS, again, it appears that we are getting a reasonable work for the lowest price possible. My questions on this student discipline behavior issue have been answered, except for one. I assume that we collect data regarding the ability of our drivers to be able to manage kids, so that if in fact there is an issue where a driver is really struggling, so that it's a combination of the students not behaving the way they should and a driver having difficulty. So I'm assuming that is data that we...
Yes, ma'am. And we've had issues where drivers, once they had children, after they went through the driver training and they had students on board, realized that they needed another work location.
Sure. Right. And I can imagine that I'm not sure I'd make a good bus driver myself. So, all right. So we do collect that on that side. Thank you.
Ms. Corbett Sanders.
Yes, thank you. And I want to first thank you, Mr. Plattenberg, for your opening remarks regarding that this is how it's supposed to work, this collaboration between excellent work being done within the OAG and then working with the individual department to have continuous process improvement. And so I was heartened that you acknowledged that at the beginning, so thank you. Just a couple of comments. One, I appreciated Mr. Moon's comments regarding the cost benefit of, you know, when do you want to swap out a bus because it's cheaper than continuous maintenance. Would be interesting, and I don't expect you to answer it here, but to have some sort of estimate of what cost savings we can expect in maintenance based on the fact that we have gone from 28% to 12% for an aging fleet. And so therefore the maintenance cost should go down. And I don't know if you're tracking that, but it would be helpful to understand that going forward. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact, and I didn't see this in here, but of the connector bus, free bus passes for our middle and high school students, and an expectation going forward as to whether or not we can actually minimize some of our own bus cost if we can push more and more of our travel into those commercial routes. And so that would be something that I'd like us to do a bit more. But along those lines, and we've talked about this when we first launched the connector bus passes, but having the connector bus pass automatically printed on the back of our students' ID cards would go a long way to doing that, because then it becomes readily available to them. And so I don't know, we talked about it a couple years ago, and I was wondering whether or not we've made any progress towards that. And it's probably not in your department, but...
It is. We've been working real well with the General County on this whole initiative, but the answer is no, we haven't made much progress in that vein because of the growth and expansion of the program. But I can't ask Mr. Taliano's here this evening. I can't ask him to bring it back to that group and suggest that as a recommendation. It is a great partnership. The challenge, as you so aptly placed out there, are the routes that are the commercial routes versus our routes that are our transportation for students,
right,
and the opportunities that are there. But certainly it's something that has been an additive and extra service, especially for those students who heretofore hadn't been able to make it, whether it's the athletics, the arts, after-school activities, additional assistance because of work or home or some other schedule. It's really opened up some avenues for some students that had challenging situations about getting travel and transport.
And we've been
areas.
urging, at least within Mount Vernon, for the connector buses to understand that it's a bit of a chicken and the egg. You've got to make sure that the routes are available so that you can then, it's more of a student usage push into it. And so one more piece on the bus passes, because this connects to the discipline piece. We found that when, at least at the high school and middle school level, some of the discipline issues on buses are attributed to kids that should not necessarily be on the bus they're on. And so going back to our student IDs is maybe, I know we've done this at West Potomac, but having the identification of which bus a student should be on their ID card, so that it is a bit of a deterrent for them to be getting on a bus that they shouldn't be on.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Schultz, followed by Mr. Wilson.
Briefly, on the not having the costs, I think that's bothersome. I'm not exactly sure why Audit wouldn't ask, because if 50% of the accidents are deemed preventable, you would want to know what is it a tree branch? Is it backing into a sign on the corner, or is it hitting somebody? And thus there are legal costs. This could be potentially huge. It could be potentially nominal. I don't know. I don't have context. So I'm going to reiterate my need to have the context. I'm wondering about the cost. So I'm going to ask what's not in the report, the cost of not having drivers, like the cost of and I don't know if this is in HR. I looked over my shoulder to see if Dr. Ramey was here. The cost of losing drivers or not having drivers, and how to quantify the impact to the system in terms of, what it costs us to not have, does that stress drivers, and then stressed drivers are more likely to have accidents? I don't know. But I've actually, for the first time in 6 years, I've had bus drivers approach me in public. I'm going to have to start going incognito to the grocery store. And really express a lot of concern that they're seriously stressed, and part of the stress is not having enough drivers, of drivers not having enough time, they're not getting enough hours. So the hours that they're having to work are, if they're given additional opportunity to drive, their field trips, which are often late, so they're up early and they're up late, and their day is very chopped, and they worry about being rested, which potentially leads to stress drivers, which potentially leads to accidents, 50% of which are preventable. I mean, you see, there's a life cycle here of it. What would happen if we paid, drivers $2 more an hour, or what would happen if we guaranteed drivers, 25 hours a week? Like, what would happen? What would happen if we did that? Yes, that would cost, but what would be the savings? Would we save all the HR time of trying to recruit drivers that we can't fill?
No, those are great questions, by the way. First of all, in terms of the cost, I think Audit and we certainly weren't sure if that was asked about the cost of the accident. Getting back to your first question, we will follow up because it's a great follow-up. We do in transportation keep that data. We don't have it before us tonight. So if Audit asked for it, then they should have it. If they didn't ask for it, they will as a result of tonight's conversation, and we'll be happy to share that and report back. The second item that you mentioned, when you talk about drivers, there is a nationwide driver shortage. We did look at every opportunity, because we received that feedback as well, providing opportunities for drivers to come in and do extra hours. And in many cases, to your point, it wasn't convenient for whether it's childcare, whether it's, as you said, the length of the day, and therefore they're exhausted. which may lead to more accidents like you suggested. We don't have currently a quantification of the impact of this driver shortage. I can tell you that I do have my bus driver supervisors who are driving on the road rather than reviewing timesheets, reviewing some of these incident reports, reviewing some of these findings so that we wouldn't have had these findings. That has been exactly as you described, pretty much throwing a pebble in the pond and seeing the ripples that broaden out. We do offer, we have offered more hours than a neighboring county. We have offered more money in the past. Right now, one of our neighboring counties is increasing. The benefits that we provide have been extremely well received, but what we keep doing is we keep chasing this lost leader of, well, they're doing this, so we're doing this. And it reminds me of the teacher shortages.
Okay,
and
so that's definitely a question that I think we need to continue having a discussion about. I brought this up before. I have an inordinate interest in facilities and transportation, maybe more than others. Propane buses and the cost of maintenance of propane buses versus the buses that we currently have has been something that I brought up before. It's sort of been eschewed as, oh, well, we don't really do that. And to my colleagues, for several years now, I've been advocating outsourcing. We're an education company. We're not a restaurant, meals, facilities, transportation company. And so it potentially, is this the time where it's right for a pilot program to look at, okay, well, we haven't found the magic answer, and the magic answer is a problem across the country. Is there potentially benefit in going to a subject matter expert and doing part of what we're doing outside of our current plan to mitigate some of what we see in this audit summary and do business a different way to try to mitigate some of these costs if it's 5% of our budget?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question, and you are talking to some of the subject matter experts. However, there are outside groups who I meet with who ask me what we're doing, and they incorporate that and provide some of those services. In fact, at the first ever National Sleep Conference, I had 2 individuals that had come in and assisted Fairfax County Public Schools in the past in looking at opportunities. So I think, to your point, yes, that is an opportunity. I think it's ripe for the lines of business discussion, because the reason why you get the responses you do in the case of propane is it's not the propane just on the propane buses. It's the service areas that you provide, because then they have to have explosion proof. Then the design for it is totally different. The lighting has to be a different type of protection. The whole area for the service bays have to be different because of the type of fuel that the vehicle runs on. Now, that doesn't mean it's insurmountable. So it's not something to go, oh, well, we can't do it. But because our service is provided by DVS, I think it's a perfect county schools conversation to delve in further.
Well, we could do maintenance not at DVS for propane buses. I mean, we have to start being innovative, and we're doing transportation the way we've always done transportation, and that's landing us with 12% is 196 buses, 12% at 15 years and older, and this problem isn't going away. So I'm going to ask and renew the effort for further conversation on this, because I think, one, we don't understand the context of the cost of some of this from this audit survey. 2, it touches a vast number of our students and has to deal with our programming and where we place things, because that's how we, our block scheduling for some kids, they have to give up, for example, 2 of their blocks to be able to get to some of the CTE programs, because we can only house them at certain schools. We only house them at certain schools, which impacts transportation. I mean, this is an interconnected problem that touches so many of our students, and yet we're still kind of doing business the way we were before. And it's not that they're not doing it well; it's that it's ripe for review, as Mr. Plattenberg said.
Thank you. I have two more board members. We are 35 minutes over. We have people waiting for the next two work sessions, so I'm going to request efficiency. Mr. Wilson?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will be efficient. Mrs. Schultz actually brought up the topic I wanted to actually mention as well. Since I think I heard you say that we're acquiring 200 buses next year, that's the order. Yeah, this year. So if, at that sort of magnitude of order, it does seem that both potentially from a savings on maintenance, cost of fuel, and of course cleaner burning engines in our fleet should certainly justify consideration of propane or compressed natural gas fueled buses. If if we're going to be buying at that rate, maybe we can phase it in over time, but it might make sense to look at with the county.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Palchik?
Thank you. Just a quick question. I don't know if you've covered this already, but looking at the FCPS and county resources, not the material that we looked here, but have we looked at staffing? Like, I assume they also have similar ways that they contract their bus drivers? And would it be helpful in the future to look at offering hours across? No.
You raise a good question. One thing I didn't go down too much further, and I'll try to be very, very brief. We have 3- and 4-tier bus runs. Most school divisions haven't even heard of 4-tier bus runs, okay? And 3 tiers a push. And when they hear the number of vehicles we have and the number of runs we have, make no mistake, this is an incredibly efficient operation for the services and the boutique services, some of that Ms. Schultz mentioned, that we offer at individual schools. Is it an opportunity? Absolutely, always. Do we always need to be looking for those opportunities? You bet. But whether it's propane and all, working with the county and DVS, it's going to take a larger collaboration. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't remember us talking more on the staffing side of it rather than the facility side of bus drivers. If we've looked at the possibility, does this give more flexibility to bus drivers or no? If they're looking for additional shifts, since we've cut back quite a bit. But maybe and to maybe have a break from kids for a route.
We still have opportunities we're trying to expand for
Okay.
those drivers that were mentioned.
Okay.
We're not there yet.
Thank you.
Dr. Brabrand?
I would just like to wrap up on my comments to say I haven't had a chance to meet with Mr. Plattenberg yet, but I'm very excited. I plan to be on buses. I want to be on some of the high student behavior buses at the beginning in my first couple of months, see what's going on. And I think when you do that, you'll have principals do the follow-up that's necessary on buses with kids that have issues. One of the things, too, and I know we do PBIS in Fairfax County, and we were doing it in my previous school district, the extent of training for our bus drivers to have some of those same behavioral techniques. You guys are already on that. And I think the more we bring our bus drivers into feeling like they are full classroom professionals, the bus is another classroom. It's another classroom. And we've got to set the tone. We've got to set the expectation that they're valued members. And I know a lot of work has already been done, and I think we can continue to think out of the box. One of the things that I've heard that I think is an powerful thing to think about in the budget, can an additional program placement at one school alleviate or decrease transportation needs to stop shipping kids back and forth and back and forth? And over time, is that a more efficient way to add that program somewhere and create more equity and access at the school than trying to ship kids from one school to another and lose a period? So those are conversations. The fun thing about tonight is my to-do list seems to be growing, but it's good. These are good questions, and I think the good news is the right questions are being asked out of this audit summary, and I'm excited about that, and I think I'm excited to start working with staff to come up with some robust responses to some of the points that have been raised tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. That was a good segue, actually, to our next work session, Facilities Planning Advisory Committee, and all the ways that facilities, transportation, and programming come together. Thank you all so much. Do we need to do next steps, board members? I don't think we had. I think we had some questions, but I think Ms. Weatherman took the questions away, and Mr. Plattenberg as well. So thank you. All right, we will take a